No mai haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups.
Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
It's so great to be back, girls. I'm loving seeing your beautiful faces again. Have you got yourself a cup of tea? Some biscuits, perhaps? Yeah, ready to go? I hope the listeners out there have settled themselves down in with their own cup of tea and a plate of biscuits, because today's chat is going to be worth at least a Tim Tam, possibly even a mellow puff. What do you girls reckon?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In fact, talking about food, that makes me think of a story I'm going to share in a moment. What about you, Lindy? Got your bickies?
Yeah, I got my bickies and my cup of tea, yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just taking me back to last week where Lindy was talking about her chickens. And we've got this like ratty-tatty wild cat roaming around, this black sort of scruffy-looking thing. And it's literally stalked one of our brand new chickens, like these beautiful black chickens with like red beak, and it ate it for dinner. Went out there, and it was like a $50 dinner. I mean, we don't pay $50 for a main meal for ourselves, let alone the local cat. So I've got this husband dreaming up all kinds of like trap options, like these ones where you stand on bits of wood and it triggers this fishing line that's got a big rope attached to it. So yeah, let's hope we don't lose any more chickens.
That sounds like the Roadrunner. Do you guys remember the Roadrunner?
No, we didn't have a TV.
No, Wile E. Coyote would always dream up ways to catch the Roadrunner. I'm revealing how old I am. No, you didn't have a TV. Yeah, we had a TV, and we were never allowed to watch it. My parents would go out and they'd come back. First thing they did was put their hand on the TV to see if it was warm, and they'd always take the aerial with them. When they were
really? Yeah. You know, kids like today won't even know what you mean by taking the aerial.
Yeah, no, they won't. Yeah, but what I have been doing recently when I go out now, because I got a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old, is I come back and I put my hand on the back of the TV. Man, it's so sad when you become like your parents.
That's hilarious.
How you been going, Lindy?
Yeah, no, pretty good overall. Just, plugging along with a million things, happening. I think the thing that I have found really interesting with regard to the culty sphere is that Radio New Zealand has kicked off what looks like it's going to be a very interesting series, putting a spotlight on the Jehovah's Witnesses. So they're obviously, quite a big, internationally anyway, a massive religious organisation, and I'm sure there's lots of good people in it as well, and I'm sure that, they're not all bad, but they also have got some practices that people are saying are very harmful, especially their extreme kind of shunning and ostracism of former members. So I found the first of those articles, I've only read the first one, very fascinating, very well researched, very insightful.
Yeah, very much so, very much on point with today's topic, isn't it? Organisations under threat. Just thinking about the cultosphere and the Gloriavale sphere. This last week, Gloriavale asked permission of the court, or sought leave, to appeal the Girls' Employment Court judgment. So that's something that we did expect and predicted, but it's just really interesting, like, why? What are your reasons for doing that? And, one of them was that this is going to have an impact on our community. It's going to impact more than just the 6 plaintiffs. And we're like, yeah, exactly. That's why these people went to court and sought this action. They do want you to change. But yeah, Guruval's, just not so keen on that concept, I think. And again, I think as we look at what we're talking about today, it's usually an abusive organisation likes to set the terms of their own change at their rate and the way they want to do it that fits in with their life. But that might not be what's right for people.
Well, in my corner of the cult sphere, I've just been watching TV. Started watching the Netflix How to Be a Cult Leader show. I've watched 3 episodes. The jury's out for me on whether it's good or not, though it's got a couple of really key international figures in it. Janja Lalich and Rachel Bernstein are talking it. But what I don't like about it is the constant focus on the cult leader and the complete lack of conversation around the harm that the followers allowed to happen, and the complete lack of mention of children. That irritates me.
Interesting. So you've watched 3 episodes. How many are there in the series?
6. Yeah, 6.
Okay.
Yeah, and
right,
it's looking at some key people, Jonestown and Charles Manson, and the other one was
David Koresh.
No, not yet. I think he's being covered. The second one was a lesser-known group called Buddha something. Jamie someone. Anyway, I will keep watching and see if they mention children and the impacts of children in these groups, because
I have heard a wee bit of criticism of that documentary too. I can't remember completely off the top of my head, but that it is like a bit sensationalist, like reaching for the really terrible, well-known kind of names, and that there's not really a lot of
constant focus on the leader.
You know, someone I read said it sort of had no more depth than a Wikipedia article. Yeah, which is a shame. It's a missed opportunity, but
That might be from people who are familiar with the cultist though. So if you're looking at your general average Joe blog, they might actually, be able to see some characteristics of leaders who are harmful.
Yeah.
So there could be of course, it absolutely plays into the narcissist's hand when they've been given a focus like this.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Perhaps we do need to be aware of the types of people who have the ability to draw in a crowd like that.
Yeah. On Cult Chat today, we're going to talk about organisations under threat. What does it look like when harm is caused by a group, an institution, or a system, and that harm is exposed? What can you expect from an organisation when they're criticised and destructive history is uncovered? How might an organisation behave when it's backed into a corner? How can you tell if apologies are genuine and promises to change are meaningful? What are concessions? And what are demonstrations, and should we accept them or not? That's what we're going to be trying to sort of unpack today as we have a little chat.
It's going to be deep.
It's going to be pretty deep. Yeah.
And on point, I think.
On point, yeah.
Why don't we have a look first at a couple of definitions, because I think they might be words that we use, throughout our conversation. And one that's really struck out to me comes from a book, Something's Not Right, by Dr. Wade Mullen, and it really has been the most, probably the most important book I think I've read on this particular topic. He talks about something called image management. And I've always sort of talked about optics, how groups have... or groups try hard to present an image out to the public. And sometimes that can be a glossy image. I think about, in our context, the Gloria Bell glossy utopian documentaries that apparently people were going to watch on TV and go and join. But Wade Mullen actually says, let's find a better term. Let's call it impression management, because it talks about the way they present themselves front of stage, but it talks about what goes on backstage and how they actually actively cover up abuse and the bad things they don't want people to look at. So that's a word I think is important for us to know.
Yeah, Irving Goffman defined impression management as the process of creating, influencing or manipulating an image held by an audience. So that's one definition.
Brilliant. So same concept, front stage, backstage, an audience, a play, a stage, or something like that. That's good. So impression management. And I think when you look at organisations in crisis or under threat, they're going to be pretty classic in how they, manage their impression.
That reminds me of The Wizard of Oz, that sort of famous little section where the man's like behind the curtain, and then the others have spotted him, but it's like, don't look at the man behind the curtain who's the one actually managing this whole show up the front.
Yeah, brilliant. I think another word just to keep in mind is the concept of sacred roles, that where you've got someone involved in like the spiritual life of someone else, maybe as a guide or a mentor, there can be some of this danger, just a power dynamic danger. You're running the risk of giving your trust to people who are in sacred roles because they're saying that they've got some special power. And so, we need to keep in mind, the role of the sacred, especially when looking at abusive institutions. Another word to just think about, another concept, is that one of endorsement. That's when a group gets bad exposure, they reach out to others to endorse them. Linda, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this area because I've noticed that quite a number of groups have got that, it might be harmful in one area or, allegedly harmful in one area, have also got other sort of goodwill, positive or charitable things that they're doing. Like we listened to Laura's interview last week, and she spoke about being part of, I think it was called a peace group. And I had a quick Google of that, and it appears that, Shincheonji has sort of rolled out these peace groups that even go into primary schools and things like that and actively teach sort of what looks like on the surface to be positive, human rights advocacy, this sort of thing. And I know, speaking of, we were also speaking earlier of Netflix watching. I watched a show a few months ago called Yahweh Ben Yahweh, and he's died now, but a famous person in the States who ran a very problematic organisation, and he was eventually jailed for some quite severe crimes. But they also did they did a lot of good in their neighbourhoods. He brought in grocery stores into very poor neighbourhoods and brought in schools and businesses. There was an impact on the economy. It makes me think again of Gloriavale, how they have got such a significant positive impact on the economy of Greymouth. And so some people don't want to kind of criticise their harmful practices at all. In my view, I think you can both affirm the good and criticise the harmful stuff, but it seems like some people are quick to polarise, to either only focus on the negative or to refuse to acknowledge the negative and to only uphold the positive.
Yeah, the issue is when it's one or the other, isn't it? It's those good things, because usually there's something good, isn't there, are used as a way to excuse or justify or deny the harm that's happened, which does actually bring us to the strategies used when an accusation is made by harmful groups to avoid facing the accusation. There's a quote by Wade Mullen. We'll reference Wade Mullen repeatedly throughout this. Some have said that getting an abuser to tell the truth is like nailing jelly to the wall. If caught, they'll use any tactic necessary to wriggle free to evade accusation to save face and to preserve their power and influence. So these are some of the four things that we might see, and those he talks in his book about the four walls of defence, and using this idea of a castle with at the centre the people that are trying to be protected, and they're surrounded by four walls. And the first wall that the enemy will face is the wall of denial, and Wade talks about this being the thickest wall, the largest one to get over, and if you can get over this one, you'll probably have more success getting over the next three. But the wall of denial, do we want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's the wall where the group who's under threat or has been accused casts doubts on the accusations. And basically, and just tries to, there's nothing to see here, it's not true, we're a nice, polite group, we do this, that and the other. And perhaps, Lindy, that's where you're looking at. Maybe think of the Brethren. They've got the, what's the name of their charity where they go and support all those events?
Oh, the Rapid Relief Team.
Yeah.
Well, that is fascinating because, I don't know if that's quite denial as such. I think that goes back a bit more to the thing of perhaps, image management, because actually the origins of the Rapid Relief Team are quite interesting because they, from 2012 to 2014 in the UK, the the Exclusive Brethren, or the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church as they're now known, were coming under scrutiny and were being refused charitable status for some of their trusts, which threw them into an absolute panic. And they, because, their whole system in each nation is deeply involved with having, and relies on, I think, with having charitable status for the financial benefit or obviously for wider things as well, but the financial advantages are significant. And so when this happened, they rolled out what's apparently a multi-million-dollar campaign globally and in the UK, a huge amount of effort to achieve charitable status. And so from that, all of a sudden in 2013, the Rapid Relief Team was born in the UK and rolled out around the world, which was quite shocking, especially for former members and for current members, because before that, and historically, and the Brethren still are known for being incredibly insular and for not actually, their whole core doctrine is about separating from wider society and the wider world. And that was literally the reason why the Charity Commission, had denied them charitable status in this instant, because they said you're not of public benefit. And so then there was these huge court cases which set a real precedent in the UK around when can a group have charitable status, and questions of what does it look like if that group is accused of harm, and what does it look like if the group can't prove that they're of public benefit. Now, that is a whole other area that we might have to talk about another day, because it is fascinating and it's very relevant for here in New Zealand. What do we do when groups have got charitable status and significant tax breaks, but are being accused of harm and may or may not be of public benefit? So, I feel like that fits under that whole area of what you're referring to earlier of, image management and all that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's definitely when they feel like they're under attack. And so you're right, the first wall is definitely deny. That, I mean, we saw that in the employment case and the girls' case. There was just this denial. It was quite surreal to sit there and listen to it. It didn't make sense because there was so much credible evidence.
I've been reading some work by a researcher called Jennifer Freyd, and I think many of us have heard of a term that she coined called DAVO, but probably don't realise it was her. DAVO means deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. So this is a really great way to do denial. When you're under attack or when you're being accused of something, is to shift the balance, turn the whole thing upside down and move the attention away from you and to cast doubt on the credibility of the witness. And suddenly, oh my God, we're under attack. We're the ones who are causing the harm, by this awful person who's suggesting that we are harmful. But look at all the good things we're doing. Actually, who are you to suggest that are you beyond reproach? Like this instant turn and shift.
Yeah, in the Gloriavale Employment Court, it was embarrassing when one of the current witnesses was reading out this portion of their brief, and they were basically saying, we're under attack from the media, where are our human rights, where is our protection from this persecution? My eyes just boggled. I'm just like, you've got actually no idea what you're saying and where you are. You're in a court of law, being, coming up with having charged,
They'll be using DAVO. Good on them.
Oh, and you're using DAVO, and it's so obvious. What I like about DAVO is it fits really beautifully into these four defences, because that first one is denial. But then as an organisation continues to come under threat and more people come out of the woodwork and make accusations, you then get the second wall of defence, and that's the excuses. So this is where a little bit of casting blame on another party, like, my motivation wasn't wrong, or it was an accident, or it was a mistake, or I had unsuitable training, or I was misunderstood. So the acceptance that, yes, I did something wrong, but actually I'm making an excuse for it. So that's a really common, that's the second wall of defence.
It was an accident. I didn't mean to cause harm. It was a mistake. Yeah, you're not really...
She was in the wrong place at the wrong time? No, that might be justifying. That might be the next wall of defence. Yeah.
I didn't realise abuse was happening. I was deceived.
Yes,
I didn't know any better. I was impaired because of stress, or the education I had didn't enable me to recognise it. I wasn't aware. I didn't have control. Others were more responsible for this than me, you know.
You know what? They're all typical. And I think what's interesting is these 4 walls of defences are not just for organisations under threat. This is for all abusers. Abusers use these 4 walls of defence. Abusers, individual abusers. And so this conversation today, it's really important to note, this is not just about cultic organisations and how they operate. This is about how abusers, individuals or corporate groups, operate. They all use these common tactics. And I think the idea of talking about them is that we might be able to identify them when they're happening around us. So, number 1, look for the denials. Number 2, look for the excuses.
You're reminding me, Liz, of some high-profile cases in American universities where a woman has brought forward a accusation of a sexual assault from an athlete who is a key athlete in the university's organisation, and the organisation's response to that has been horrendous. And in fact, I'm thinking of one example that I read about a couple of days ago of a woman who was so taken down by the sports team sending her text messages saying, how dare you? How dare you accuse our sports team member of these crimes? And then she committed suicide soon after, and the university didn't even... Wow. I could dig out the actual case. I can't even remember what book I was reading. The university didn't even acknowledge that they had a role in that.
Wow, that is terrible. I was also thinking about how groups have got these little phrases often that they say to participate in these things that you're talking about denying and covering up, or kind of even distraction as well, eh? Like, look over there, rather than look here at what's going on. Like, I was just thinking about, when I was in the Brethren, there was this phrase that we had called protect the testimony, because they referred to themselves as the testimony or the position, which, wasn't referring to anything sexual. It was referring to the fact that they had the divinely blessed position or something like that. So they would have this phrase, protect the position or protect the testimony. Yep. That was used in lots of cases, and looking back it was to I feel that it was to try and deny and distract from what was going on. And I have had, for example, parents who had children who were abused. We've had, reports of parents saying that they were told not to take the abuse to the relevant authorities or to the police, because it would, make the Brethren look bad, and that it would discredit the position. And so these parents were actively told, protect the position, don't report this stuff.
It's tragic. And Gloriavale, one step further, not just teaching it and indoctrinating their people from birth about that, they signed it. They signed these documents when they were signing commitment vows and partnership. I will never take my brother to court. I will not go to the authorities. Fancy signing, and so then to the peril of my soul, which of course means I'm going to hell. Yeah, so you're looking at these very typical denials, excuses. Let's think about the 3rd wall of defence.
The justifications.
Justifications. This is like turning the attention away from themselves and justifying or rationalising the wrongdoing. And perhaps it's because I was protecting the witness, the testimony. Actually, that's probably a wrong place, wrong time, just justifying their behaviour. Or I believed I'm entitled to do this.
Or she was
a justification.
Or look at how she was dressed.
Yeah, there you go.
Or she was drinking. Classic. That's obviously the individual abuse scenario, not the group abuse scenario, but that's still used. If any sexual assault accusation is made, it's quickly moving the focus away from the harms that have been caused or potentially caused by the perpetrator or person who's been accused or group that's been accused, to actually look narrower and let's talk about the victim or the person who's bringing forth this complaint and see how they could have been responsible for what happened.
Yeah, and that makes me think about this whole area of discrediting the critics. That's a massive thing that these groups do, right? Is that they kind of character assassinate anybody who criticises them. Like, I know I was speaking with some former Jehovah's Witnesses recently, and they talked about how if anybody speaks up against the Jehovah's Witnesses internally, they're then labelled as being language like bitter and poison. And so current members are warned away from talking to them because they are poisonous. Well, I was fascinated to hear that because that's the exact language that the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church use. They, in fact, my own brother, it was in the news a couple of years back when the world leader of the Brethren told him that he was better to drink rat poison or arsenic than to have to do with an outsider. And so that shows you that level of thinking that for them and their worldview, to have to do with any critics or to engage with it at all is equivalent to engaging with poison. Like that's massive, that sort of massive black marking and discrediting of anybody who criticises them.
Yeah, you're right. And that's the typical thing. And bitter is the Gloriavale word. And they used it in court. It was so embarrassing when the Gloriavale side were asking questions of Dr. Norris, the forensic psychologist, and they said,
psychiatrist,
they said, have you ever heard of chronic embitterment syndrome? And I have to say that just about choked. But
how funny.
I know, and they PTED or something, it's got a name, post-trauma embitterment syndrome. I'm like, well, there it goes. If leavers have got some chronic embitterment, clearly it's post-trauma.
Is that in
where did the trauma occur in your group?
Is that in the DSM-5, do you think?
It wasn't. And she said, over lunch, she got time to read the article over lunch they'd provided. She came back and said, no, she said, this is a proposed new syndrome. A lot of these articles go around. And she said, and it was based on German soldiers' Berlin War. It was inside that context of war. And when I read the description of it, I just sort of put my hand in my head and I thought, this is going to backfire on you. But this is Gloriavale's word. You're just bitter. Like,
it's interesting because they also, often these groups for former members or anybody who criticises them, it's also that language of either they're like demonically possessed, like they've gone to Satan type of language is used, or that you're mentally unwell. That's another really common one, which I know I was accused of that at one point. That you're deceived. And then of course the media one is fascinating because it seems like lots and lots of groups hate the media or blame the media for being out to attack them, which is really interesting because really at the heart of it, it's because the media is exposing them, arguably.
However, there can be some quite salacious and irresponsible use of media. We can't pretend that that's not the case.
Yes.
I remember, I think the newspaper articles in the early 80s about Centrepoint, the tone of them was, kiddie sex cult kind of titles, those kind of
clickbait.
Yes, and it just really doesn't help. However, I think, we've listened to Anka's interview and we've talked about and I think we'll continue to talk about the role of the media. Does the media cause harm? The balance between, getting the information out and protecting people who have already been plenty harmed by not exposing more. There's a real balance. And
there is.
Yeah, and I'm sure it'll come up again. But looking at these...
I think the media, they're making some great progress in that. I've been quite impressed, actually, just thinking about the Gloriavale sphere.
Absolutely.
Because, there could be sensational stories every week. I mean, there's stuff that just won't go in the newspapers and people would be shocked to hear what actually has gone on in Gloriavale. But, the media, I feel like, have actually
the media, just like the frontline medical staff and psychologists and therapists, they're all members of the public, right?
That's
and
right.
the more we, as members of the public, become more aware of these issues and more sensitive to them and more respectful and blaming of victims far less, the more we, as also professionals, people who are in a professional capacity as well as members of the public, can speak to that with sensitivity too. Right. Moving into the final wall of defence, if you've managed to scale the denial, they've accepted it's real, you've moved past the excuses, you've jumped over the wall of justifications, you end up with the final wall. Liz, what is it?
Comparisons. This is where you say, this happens everywhere in the world, or, other groups have similar problems. And Lindy, do you remember telling me the story of you jumping on the plane recently and a Gloriavale couple were sitting behind you? Can you just tell us about the last portion of your listened in to their conversation? And there was a comment made when the person sitting next to them mentioned about the abuse at Gloriavale. Do you recall that?
Oh my gosh, I don't recall it properly. I know I told you about it. No, I can't think of what you're specifically
So you're listening in to a leader and his wife on an aeroplane, and he spends an hour, whatever, preaching about Gloriavale and
they were strongly advocating for what a wonderful community Gloriavale was, and saying that everything in the media was twisted, and that they were a lovely Christian community that was very family orientated and had big meals together and this type of thing.
And then the person next to you actually sort of challenged them. So what about the abuse allegations? And you said that the man had said, "Oh, that's all just blowing up in the media. It's not actually as bad as that." And you said the wife then said, "Well, actually, there has been some wrong done." And then he answered, "Oh, yeah, but that happens everywhere in the world." Mm-hmm. And that is just such a typical answer.
And not recently, it was about 4 years ago, part of my role of managing the Centrepoint Restoration Project, I put blogs up and articles, and I can't remember what I'd written that prompted this, but out of the blue I got a very toxic email from a person who had created an anonymous email so that they could put the feedback through, and it was full of justifications and excuses for the history of child abuse at Centrepoint. What this person did actually say was that the media is responsible for causing the majority of the harm that children of Centrepoint have had to navigate, and that nothing was happening at Centrepoint from a sexual abuse perspective that was any different than what was going on in the rest of Auckland at the time. So Centrepoint was just another family that had a little bit of sexual abuse in it, no different from all the other families around Auckland. And that was just like, wow, you still believe this? Someone out there still believes this with all this evidence. That is still a response.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. I know when the police went into Gloriavale and they shared a letter about the extent of the harm between 60 and 80, young people involved in various types of sexual harmful behaviour. And that's shocking. The police said, this is some of the worst that we've dealt with and we've seen. And yet, at some point during the conversation, there was also an attempt to try and soften the blow for these parents. And apparently it was sort of said, but these things do happen in other places. But they made a point of saying, but this is literally some of the worst we've ever come across. But that's not what the members of Gloriavale heard and repeat to this day. They repeat the fact that the police told them that this stuff happens everywhere. Yeah. I find that so disturbing.
So with comparisons, the abuser will use other issues or people as examples to make the wrongdoing seem less serious or discourage being held to account for their actions. There's so much worse issues to be concerned about than this. Boys will be boys. We've always done it this way. We're doing better than other organisations. This is a smear campaign. Look at all the good things we've done. That's where the whole look at all the good things we've been doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm just thinking about recently a young man who is gay who came out of the Brethren, has been speaking up about it, and there was a media article about him, and they got the journalist had also got a Brethren spokesperson to speak, and this person's response was, when asked, are the Brethren homophobic, that the spokesperson had said, the Brethren's views are no different to many other religious groups across Australia. And so again, it was a classic comparison thing, and yet that took away from the reality of what they were being criticised for, because the Brethren in Australia actually had a doctor who was a Brethren doctor, and he prescribed basically castration sort of drugs to Craig Hoyle, a young gay New Zealander who was part of the Brethren. And it was he got eventually, I believe, struck off the medical register for doing that, and it only came out after Craig had left the Brethren and talked about that. But yeah, I just thought that was a fascinating example, that this organisation that had actually used one of their own doctors to medically castrate somebody, that's quite a severe and strong act against a gay person. But then when criticised about how they treat gay people, they just said, we're just very similar to lots of other religious organisations. It's like, no, you're quite extreme on this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think about that whole like castle concept. It's called the walls of defence for a reason. They're actually putting up walls of defence because they feel like they're coming under attack. And they are. Yes. And so what happens to a group when the onslaught just keeps coming at them and they're really, really under attack? They're up against the back of the wall, their arm is screwed up their back. And Wade Mullen talks about the most common tactic from here is something called demonstrations. And this just so rings true for me. This is where they make a public accommodation, they make a change or an apparent change or a promise of change. They demonstrate that they are changing because they need to change the view that the public has of them. They're trying to win your favour now. And so Mullen says, I want to encourage you to remain discerning and willing to confront abuse so you do not fall for the final ploy. And he says this is one of the most difficult steps in the process of an organisation in crisis and is discerning the final acts of deception. So let's have a talk about what these demonstrations can look like.
Oh, they're really tricky because it's the people who have been harmed who can see through, but they often don't have the words to kind of, why does this ring false? What they're saying the right things, but what is it about this show, this demonstration, this act that feels like it's empty? Whereas the general public, they don't have the relationship or the insight, or they haven't got the inside information that's been covered up usually to kind of just do that discerning. So it's very tricky for bystanders or observers to, without all the facts, to support people who are trying to stand up for their right for like truth, really. Oh, so, yeah. So I you know, I've certainly encountered this as well. And where's that quote? That wonderful quote? An authentic apology, especially when it is offered in response to significant and long-term harm, will be so clearly distinct from every prior experience that it will be unquestionably received. It will appear like a flash of light in a darkened room, like an exploding clap of thunder in the dead of night, like the unveiling of a hidden treasure, like the resurrection from the dead, not because of any of the apologizer's qualities, but because of the innate power of truth.
Oh, I love that quote. I've actually got it highlighted and blown up large and printed out. That quote is talking about the power of truth. And when truth is given properly, wholeheartedly, the abused person actually takes it in and knows they've been properly apologised to. And actually want to come back to that because apologies are the number one way that groups do a demonstration. They'll often put out a statement or an apology, but often you can actually score that apology. So that's probably where we should head our discussion, because Mullen is saying often these groups sacrifice truth. And so demonstrations actually can cause long-term harm if they're still based on deception. If they're trying to protect an abuser's image, they actually present a dangerous false hope. We're changing. Like you actually get people's hope up, and it actually can destroy people's religious faith, their trust of others, their hope for justice. And I know in the Gloriavale context, Gloriavale have been talking about, we're changing, we're going to change for years now. But it's not the kind of change they're looking at. It's not a change to the schedule when breakfast is or where they eat lunch. People in there want heart change, the control to disappear, the falseness, the deception, the lies to go. That's not the change they're actually getting. So he calls it the tragedy of demonstrations. And so he says the last step in the cover-up of dark secrets is convincing others to endorse the demonstrations as evidence of real change. Wow.
What does it mean by others there? Is it talking about members, or is it talking about, for example, to give an example again from the Brethren, I recently was, somebody told me that the Brethren were being actively encouraged to contact persons of influence in their city, and it didn't sort of specify what, but it was in connection with, I believe, the rapid relief team. which I thought was a really strange goal for a charitable organisation that's supposed to be about alleviating poverty and everything. I thought, well, what are they doing contacting persons of influence if they're not doing, to me, that seems like a clear indication that they're, just trying to get some persons of influence on side perhaps with them. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
That's endorsement. So that's how it's one of the things they try and do during their demonstrating process. And so basically they're trying to convince current members, former members, wherever the threat is coming from, agencies, government, whatever. And so Gloria Vale put out the classic apology. So they lost the boys' employment court hearing last year, May. A couple of weeks later, they put out this, what they called an apology. But what people need to know is there's a difference between an apology and a concession. And you can actually score an apology. And if it's an apology, you know it's true. And if you're asking yourself at the end of an apology, is that real? Mullen would say it's probably not, because you know when you've been given a real apology.
That leads me to thinking about really the only public apology that I can think of around the Centrepoint story. No, 2012, I think it was, when Bert Potter died. At his funeral, one of his sons, I think he's got more than one, took the opportunity in a eulogy to reference Bert's behaviour. And I was reading through that last night or the night before, and there was some, 2 or 3 sentences referencing his father's treatment and how he'd harmed people and how it wasn't acceptable. And on the face of it, it looked really good. These words, these half-a-minute words that the Bert Potter's son had shared. And in fact, a number of people not close to the Centrepoint story has referenced that apology as being significant and meaningful. Yet in my interactions with this same person over the last several years, I haven't seen any follow-through whatsoever, and in fact I've seen quite undermining actions. To me, it's a dangerous public display to say words that have no follow-through, have no teeth, no willingness to actually bring about change. And in fact, in further conversations about things that needed to be done to make right with the children of Centrepoint, this same person had emphasised to me how important it was that the terms of the apologies or kind of making right for him and his friends, other former adults of the Centrepoint community, were on their terms. Like, he emphasised how important it was that media wasn't part of it, how important it was that they felt safe when talking to previous victims, how important it was that only people who they trusted was going to have a conversation with them about the historical abuse. How important it was that the apology or discussion around apologies happened in their terms. And it just left me flabbergasted. That's not making right. When the perpetrator of harm emphasises how important it is that they are safe.
Yep, and it's typical. Yeah. An abuser drives the apology process and sets out their terms of reference. And that's where you get people doing settlement, say in a financial sense, and then they've got these clauses where they're never allowed to speak about it. That's all about the group wanting to repair their image. It's not about genuine change at all.
It's a demonstration.
We shouldn't fall for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And I think it's especially interesting because right now the Royal Commission of Inquiry is working with the government, or one of their recommendations to the government is that a national apology is given to all survivors of abuse that have happened under state and faith-based care in this country. So I think this, the terms of what this is going to look like hasn't actually yet been kind of settled on, but it will be very interesting. And I totally agree with you guys that it's absolutely essential that this apology is not just words, that it's also backed up with tangible action, which is what the Royal Commission of Inquiry is supposedly, working with the government to achieve with a new independent redress system. But yeah, I think there's a huge amount of cynicism among people who have been abused in our nation, because there's just been very little actual concrete redress taken place so far. And a bit like what you just said, it feels often like the apology is on the terms of the abuser, and it can make them feel good because they've done their apology, and it can make them look good because it looks like they've done the right thing. And actually, where the rubber really hits the road is, has actual change taken place? Has actual restitution taken place for the survivors?
Yeah, and they actually say an authentic apology will be fueled by internal factors like integrity and compassion. So there's an intrinsic motivation to, go ahead and go through with an apology. And I think sometimes, and you can see it quite classically in the groups like Gloriavale, there's an expectation. I gave you the apology. Now you're supposed to forgive and forget. And that actually came out in the court case. Well, we printed an apology in the newspaper. Like, no one believed it. I mean,
wow.
So no, you didn't. You printed a concession because you got caught out. That's what you did. And then you invited the public, please don't stop providing us with your financial support, and don't blame our businesses because we've got women and children here who might go hungry. They literally wrote that in their apology, and I've blogged about it on the Daily Vale, on the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust page about their apology and the response to it. It's terrible.
So I think we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between a concession and an apology, and I'd like to start with what a true apology looks like. One of my favourite authors is a woman called Harriet Lerner. She's fantastic. And in her book, Why Won't You Apologise?, she outlined the true ingredients of a true apology. And I'll just run through them, and we'll just put it there. The ingredients, okay, number one, it does not include the word but. Whatever follows the word but will be a criticism, excuse, justification. Nothing after it matters. It focuses on the perpetrator's actions, not the victim's response. Instead of saying, I'm sorry if you felt hurt by me saying, we need to say, I'm sorry for saying. The first apology has no accountability. It includes an offer of restoration or restitution that fits the situation. It shows that the person understands what they've done. It doesn't get caught up in who was more to blame for the problem or who started it. It requires a change of behaviour. An apology has no meaning if the perpetrator then repeats what they're apologising for. It does not silence the victim or anyone else, nor is it used to get out of or shut a conversation down. It's not about making the perpetrator feel better. It's about what the victim needs. It does not ask the hurt parties do anything, not even to forgive. It is unconditional. And it is not the end to a conversation. It de-intensifies the situation to allow room for further conversations.
Oh,
Go, Harriet.
That's amazing. I love that. What I love is the flip side of what a good apology looks like, because often you can look at it in the negative way. And I think the negative's fine, because Wade Mullen looks at the way you score an apology, SCORE. S for surrender, do they give up the desire to defend? C, confession, does it name the wrong and acknowledge it fully? O, ownership, does it acknowledge the active role they had in the wrongdoing? R, recognition, does it specifically state the harm caused by the wrongdoing? And E, empathy, does it make a true connection with the weight of what's being done? And he says a false apology acknowledges the wrong, but still want to be seen as incapable of future wrongdoing. Like, trust me, we're not going to let that happen again. And then they say things like mistakes were made, or this happened before the current leadership, or they say this is not in accordance with our values. Like, they want you to think the aberration is an outlier or it was outside their ability to control. And these are not apologies. These are called concessions. Oops, I got caught out and now I need to restore my mana with wider society.
Surrounded by barriers of defence and self-promotion, used as a mean to avoid shame, insist on legitimacy, maintain power and keep favour. That's a concession. It's rubbish and we have to be able to see through them.
Yes, and you know why some people who've been abused, they want to cling to that? Because they desperately want hope and they want to be able to move on and they want acknowledgement. And so they're sort of being given crumbs from the king's table sometimes, and they're kind of desperate to say, I think I got an apology. But in their hearts, they know it was just rubbish.
I know, and the problem is the shame stays with them instead of going onto the shoulders of the person who caused the harm. It's really damaging.
It is, actually, and that brings us to just another part of that conversation. It's about abuse being a public matter, because shame is something that's in silence, and there's this view that abuse is like someone's personal and private matter and that we can actually ignore it, but actually abuse is a community concern. And I think we all need to be asking ourselves individually and corporately, are we perpetuating abuse through our silence, acceptance or our tacit endorsement of those who are in the wrong. And Mullen goes on to say that we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor. It never helps the victim.
Yeah.
He says, and he encourages people to withdraw support from abusive groups and people. So he's very much on the side of you call out abuse, you pull your support. He said too many people enjoy the fruits of what abusive communities produce. It might be teachings or work of art or the community feeling or whatever it is that they enjoy, the good things. But he said sometimes a decision to withdraw support is necessary to empty its pockets, to pry open its fists and silence its tongues. And this is good, not only for the oppressed, but it's also good for the oppressor, who remains locked in their prison of deception. I'm like, wow. So if we can learn what the tactics are, blow them open to the public, expose them, then the abuser is left exposed and his defences fall and crumble. And that's what we want to see, harmful organisations whose defences crumble.
That does make me think, though, about, I mentioned Jennifer Freyd earlier in the conversation. She is also a theory that she developed as a theory of betrayal blindness, and she also talks about institutional betrayal. And it kind of makes me think, well, what happens when the organisation that has betrayed you is your government? Yeah. When the problem with institutional betrayal is that, it's when action isn't taken that should have been taken. It occurs when a trusted and powerful institution such as a school, church, military, government acts in ways that visit harm on those dependent on them, who should be safe with them, who trust them for their well-being. Institutional action and inaction exacerbates the impact of other traumatic experiences. So it's an additional layer on top. And I'm thinking of Glory of our children and families who had all the awful stuff happen and are still having all the awful stuff happen, yet there's this additional level of betrayal from the government.
Yes, definitely. And you know what you do if you don't get a right answer from the government? You do what the Leavers did. They sued the government. That's what the employment court was. They sued the Labour Inspectorate for their failure to recognise worker exploitation. It's a good way to get the government's attention.
That's so interesting, that institutional betrayal thing, because I know that, many former members that I've talked to have found the phrase betrayal trauma as being very, very helpful for explaining what they've experienced. But it's so true that it's not just often a sense of betrayal from former family and friends, but it's from institutions that are supposed to have, safeguarding, particularly of children and vulnerable persons at their core. But and the litigation one is really interesting. I don't know if we want to talk about that for a few minutes, but Liz, you've obviously just raised former members litigating, which does happen. But again, it's incredibly costly, isn't it? Not only financially, but mentally and emotionally. And a lot of people just don't have the stomach for it, especially if they're dealing with trauma and trying to rebuild their lives on top of it.
That's right.
And it also can be very difficult to take. There might be pathways for taking, say, one individual abuser to account or to court, but it can be difficult to take an entire institution. And I think in my experience, going back to the Brethren, it's more the shoe's been on the other foot, that it's been the Brethren who have frequently litigated former members, and in their view, it's always for justifiable reasons. It's they are accusing former members of defamation or slander or of breaching copyright, things like that. But it's that is another tactic that sometimes organisations take when they're under threat, is that they litigate those who are threatening them in their power.
That's incredible. Yeah, that's amazing. You were just talking a moment ago about some of the concept of sort of justice and it makes me think of accountability. And I think that's like there are a whole lot of steps that are all wound up in something else you mentioned about forgiveness. And Mullen says that forgiveness is a deeply personal journey and it shouldn't be forced and pushed on people. And he said he learned to forgive the people who abused him, but he said it did not call off his pursuit of truth. If anything, it accelerated it. So you can forgive someone and still go for accountability and still go through court and want to see things repaired. You don't have to put up with the crumbs of a shoddy-looking concession or a false apology. You don't have to believe it. There are other ways for you to move forward.
I've really enjoyed this conversation that we've had today, ladies. We're kind of cruising towards the end of our time, and I'm wondering if we all just want one last little point to chip in to leave our listeners with. Final point.
Final quote out of Wade Mullen's book, Something's Not Right. And he said, "Truth helps us move on from confusion to clarity and from captivity to freedom. Something's not right. But by understanding the tactics of the abusers in your life, you can take back the pen and write your story anew." I hope today that we have helped uncover some of the tactics that groups use and give you hope for a future where your wounds are healed.
Somebody recently shared a quote with me which just sprang to mind now, but it's probably more specifically kind of encouraging for anybody who feels that organisations that they're kind of critiquing or challenging are kind of coming after them. And it's a quote from Harriet Tubman from the days of the slave trade in America, and she said, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. And I thought that was a really powerful quote, like just about kind of having courage to keep acting and keep calling out things, even if you're being threatened and intimidated.
I think something we have to touch on is that big question, is change possible? And Wade Mullen spent time with 1,000 institutions looking at ones that had harmful practices, and he said, unfortunately, no amount of patience will produce change in an abusive community that isn't willing to surrender its legitimacy and pursue the entire truth. He said abusers find it difficult, if not impossible, to truly apologise. So that's quite disturbing. And he says this, who leads the process? Abusive groups often say it's going to take time, you need to be patient. He said, but the victims deserve and therefore bystanders ought to demand immediate truth-seeking and truth-telling. If leadership is governed by truth and not by deception, then they will seek and speak the truth no matter the cost. And if that cost entails lawsuits, falling attendance, or even shuttering the doors of the institution, then it is worth the cost, because the establishment of truth will always matter more than our establishments.
We trust that there's something in today's episode which will help you to cult-proof your life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please keep listening to more episodes of Cult Chat on Plains FM. You can find additional information about this episode in the show notes. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Find further information on our Facebook page, Cult Chat. Tell your friends, share the links to the show, leave a review so our message can spread further throughout the cultiverse. Ka kite anō.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.